Tonight, we're drifting back in time, way back to the Middle Ages, a time of castles, cobblestone streets, candlelight, and not a single tube of toothpaste in sight. While knights rode into battle and monks copied manuscripts, one mystery remains. How did medieval people take care of their teeth, if at all? In this slow, sleepy journey, we'll gently wander through the history of oral hygiene before toothbrushes, exploring what people used to clean their teeth, or whether they even bothered. So tuck yourself in, close your eyes, and let's begin. In the dim glow of flickering candlelight, medieval towns bustled with life, blacksmiths hammering in their forges, merchants shouting from wooden stalls, and the distant tolling of church bells echoing across cobblestone streets. It was a time before toothpaste, before floss, before the minty sting of mouthwash. And yet, even then, people had teeth, and those teeth needed some form of care, whether they knew it or not. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine a time of dirt and disease, of poor hygiene and little self-care. And while much of that is true, the reality is more nuanced. Medieval people were not unaware of cleanliness. In fact, many of them, especially in certain regions and social classes, had daily routines that included washing their face, combing their hair, and yes, even attending to their teeth, though not in ways we would recognize today. Most peasants lived close to the land, and their diets were primarily made up of coarse bread, root vegetables, beans, and whatever herbs or fruits were in season. Because sugar was incredibly rare and expensive, more precious than gold in some areas, the average person consumed far less of it than we do today. This inadvertently spared many people from the kind of rampant tooth decay modern diets can cause. Their food was tough, fibrous, and often gritty from the stones used to grind flour, which naturally helped scrape plaque from their teeth, though it also wore them down over time. But this doesn't mean people walked around with perfectly white, gleaming smiles. Dental knowledge was limited, and pain was often a mystery. A toothache might be blamed on toothworms, a belief that tiny creatures lived inside your teeth and caused pain when they became agitated. Remedies ranged from herbal poultices to more superstitious solutions like charms or prayers. There was no dentistry as a recognized science, and oral health was often lumped in with general folk medicine. Still, archaeological evidence from skeletons suggests that tooth decay was not as widespread among medieval populations as one might assume. Wear and tear were common, teeth ground down from hard bread, gritty grains, or even using the teeth as tools. But cavities were relatively rare compared to modern populations. Some skeletons show signs of abscesses or tooth loss later in life. Yet many individuals kept a good portion of their teeth well into old age. Monks, who were among the more literate and health-conscious members of society, sometimes wrote down basic hygiene practices, including rudimentary tooth-cleaning routines. In various monastic texts and herbals, we find references to rinsing the mouth with herbal concoctions, or using wool cloths soaked in wine to scrub the teeth. The practice wasn't widespread among the lower classes, but the idea that oral hygiene mattered existed, just in a very early form. We also have to remember that cleanliness was often tied to spiritual purity. In many religious traditions, maintaining bodily cleanliness was seen as a way of honoring God. While this primarily applied to washing the hands and face, it may have occasionally extended to other forms of self-care. Nobles and wealthier townsfolk sometimes had access to communal bathhouses, before the Black Death and other plagues made public bathing less popular. In these places, some people may have taken an extra moment to tend to their mouth, even if just with a rinse or a wipe. In truth, most medieval people probably didn't think much about their teeth until something went wrong, and when it did, there were few options. The village barber was often the one called upon to extract a bad tooth. With no anesthetics, it was a brutal, noisy, and painful process, often involving a metal tool and a lot of yelling. People prayed not to have tooth problems, not because they feared the decay, but because they feared the cure. Despite all this, life went on. People smiled, they laughed, they ate and sang and kissed. They lived their lives not with Colgate or dental floss, but with whatever nature and tradition had handed down. And while their understanding of oral health was primitive, their resilience was not. Their world was simpler, harder, and often more painful, but it was also deeply human. And so, as you close your eyes and let the quiet of the past settle over you, imagine a time when teeth weren't polished or bleached, but simply there, tools for survival, companions through meals and songs, slowly worn by life itself. There was no need for perfect smiles, only the strength to carry on through the days, one bite at a time. In the absence of toothbrushes, toothpaste, or dentists, medieval people had to rely on what was immediately available to them, the natural world. And while their options were limited, their ingenuity was not. Long before modern plastic bristles and electric brushes, people reached for twigs, sticks, feathers, and even bits of cloth to clean their teeth in the most basic and instinctive ways. The idea of using a small stick to rub or scrape the teeth dates back far before the Middle Ages, with roots in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China. By the medieval period, the use of what we might now call a chewing stick or toothstick had made its way across various cultures. These were usually thin, soft twigs plucked from specific trees, often ones known to have medicinal or antimicrobial properties. People would chew one end of the twig until it frayed slightly, forming a kind of natural brush. Then, they would gently rub the frayed end along their teeth and gums. Not just any tree would do. Willow, hazel, applewood, and birch were popular in certain parts of Europe. In the Islamic world, where hygiene was closely tied to religious practice, the miswak, a twig from the Salvadora persica tree, was widely used and praised for its cleaning ability. In Christian Europe, there were fewer formal guidelines, but similar tools emerged naturally out of necessity. The goal was the same everywhere: to remove bits of food stuck between teeth and to freshen the breath, even if the knowledge of plaque or bacteria was centuries away. Sometimes, rather than a twig, people used simple pointed objects, bone, metal, or wooden toothpicks. These were especially useful after meals, and some wealthier individuals even carried ornate toothpicks with them, tucked into belt pouches or hung on chains like jewelry. It became something of a status symbol to pick one's teeth leisurely after a feast, as if to say, "I've eaten well, and I care enough to pick clean." Of course, these tools were far from gentle. Without soft nylon bristles or ergonomic handles, they could be rough on the gums. Overuse or aggressive scraping might cause irritation or bleeding. Still, compared to doing nothing at all, a twig or toothpick was at least a step toward cleanliness, an act of intentional care in a world where so little was truly sanitary. In other cases, cloth came into play. A person might wrap a bit of linen or wool around their finger, dab it in wine, salt, or vinegar, and rub it over their teeth to wipe away residue or bad smells. This method, though crude, could also feel soothing, especially if the cloth was soaked in an herbal mixture of mint, sage, or thyme. These plants were known for their scent and were believed to carry protective, even magical properties. Gently massaging the gums with such a cloth might offer a brief sense of relief or freshness, even if the real cleaning power was minimal. Feathers, too, were used, not to brush the teeth, but to delicately reach between them. A soft bird feather might be employed to dislodge a stubborn bit of bread or meat. It wasn't an everyday habit, but in the absence of floss or more refined tools, it served a purpose. Anything slender and bendable became fair game in the quest to avoid discomfort. For the poor, these practices were not ritualized but practical. You chewed on a stick not to keep your teeth white, but to stop them from rotting. You poked between your molars, not out of vanity, but to remove the husk of a barley seed that wouldn't budge. But for the wealthy, especially those in royal courts or among the nobility, tooth care could be slightly more refined, though still primitive. Some had access to imported herbs, spices, or perfumed oils. They might chew cloves or fennel seeds for breath, or use specially carved ivory tools to clean their teeth, though even these were more ornamental than effective. What's fascinating is how natural and instinctive many of these behaviors were. Even without the benefit of science or dental education, people recognized the discomfort of dirty teeth. They learned by experience. If food stayed stuck, it caused pain. If the mouth tasted foul, rinsing helped. So over time, they developed simple, repetitive habits. Chew this twig, scrape with that stick, rinse after eating, that mirror some of our modern practices, even if their understanding of the why was still centuries away. There's a certain comfort in imagining someone from 900 years ago, sitting on a wooden bench outside their home, gently working a hazel twig between their teeth as the sun sets behind a church steeple. They're not thinking about fluoride or enamel strength. They're simply doing what humans have always done, trying in small and humble ways to take care of their bodies. And in this quiet moment of oral care, we find something deeply human, the need to soothe, to cleanse, to find comfort in routine. Whether it was a twig, a feather, or a scrap of cloth, medieval people, like us, longed for relief from discomfort, for the freshness that follows a simple act of self-care. And while the tools may have changed, the instinct has never left us. In a world without toothpaste or fluoride, medieval people turned to the resources they trusted most: herbs, ashes, salt, and the ancient wisdom of plants. It was a time when the line between medicine, magic, and daily hygiene was thin, and everything that touched the body had meaning, spiritual, physical, or both. And when it came to keeping the mouth clean, or at least less offensive, people relied heavily on the earth beneath their feet, and the ashes left after the fire had burned low. Herbs were central to medieval life. They were grown in monastery gardens, wild harvested from meadows and forests, and lovingly dried and stored in woven pouches or ceramic jars. Mint, sage, thyme, rosemary, and lavender were especially favored. These were not only fragrant, but believed to have healing properties. Mint freshened breath and cooled the mouth. Sage, whose name comes from the Latin salvia, meaning to heal, was considered a holy herb, cleansing and curative, used for everything from sore throats to mental clarity. In oral care, crushed sage leaves might be rubbed directly on the gums or steeped in vinegar for a sharp-tasting rinse. Sometimes, dried herbs were ground into powder using a mortar and pestle, mixed with coarse salt or even powdered charcoal, and applied to the teeth with a damp cloth or the finger. The grainy texture helped scrape away food residue, and the herbal oils masked unpleasant smells. These early dentifrices, though primitive, had their own kind of logic, rough enough to clean, bitter enough to feel like they were working, and scented enough to cover whatever natural odors might have lingered. Then there were ashes. Fireplaces were the heart of every medieval home, and ashes were in constant supply. Wood ash was commonly used in cleaning, laundry, floors, and even the body. People believed that what burned away impurities in the hearth could do the same for the human mouth. A pinch of cooled ash, sometimes mixed with salt or herbs, was used as a rudimentary tooth powder. It had an abrasive quality that scoured the teeth and left the mouth with a smoky, earthy taste. Though modern science would warn us of the risks of harsh abrasives on enamel, medieval people judged results by how something felt. If it made the teeth feel smoother, cleaner, or less fuzzy, it was considered effective. Salt played a major role as well. Easily stored and widely available, salt was treasured not just for flavor and food preservation, but for its supposed purifying properties. People believed salt could drive away illness and evil. As a tooth-cleaning agent, salt was either used dry, rubbed along the teeth and gums, or dissolved in water to make a rinse. Some added vinegar or wine for extra potency. The result was a mouthwash that stung, tingled, and left a sharp aftertaste, possibly helping reduce bacterial growth, even if people didn't understand the concept of bacteria. Combinations of these ingredients varied from region to region and from household to household. A simple recipe might call for a mixture of dried mint, powdered charcoal, and crushed rock salt, stored in a small jar and used with a fingertip. Another might use burnt rosemary branches ground into ash, combined with wine-soaked sage leaves and applied with a bit of linen. There were no standardized formulas. Each preparation was a little different, a reflection of local customs, available plants, and personal preferences. Herbalists and healers often passed down these recipes orally or recorded them in manuscript collections. Monks in particular took great care to document useful remedies, often combining ancient Roman knowledge with Christian spiritual practices. In some religious orders, taking care of the body, teeth included, was considered an extension of caring for the soul. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and so a minty breath wasn't just pleasant, it was spiritually uplifting. Of course, not everyone had access to such mixtures. The poor, who lived far from monasteries or herbalists, might simply chew a piece of mint or fennel if they found it growing wild. They might swish their mouth with cold water from the well or rub their teeth with salt alone. These were modest efforts, but not meaningless ones. Even the act of trying to clean the mouth was a sign of awareness, a nod to the fact that health, even in such difficult times, was something worth preserving. Interestingly, the sense of taste and smell played a huge role in what people believed worked. A strong flavor, bitter, spicy, or sharp, was interpreted as powerful. A cleaning paste that burned the tongue or made the eyes water was trusted more than one that didn't. If it hurt a little, it must be healing. That was the general logic. The idea of pleasant or gentle dental care wouldn't come until centuries later. It's easy to smile now at the thought of someone bending over a basin, scrubbing their teeth with ashes and salt, rinsing with vinegar, and chewing a handful of thyme leaves to sweeten their breath. But this was their reality. In a world where sickness could come at any moment and where pain often had no remedy, these small acts of care, gritty, bitter, and smoky as they were, offered comfort. They provided a sense of control, a way to protect oneself in an uncertain world. So, while the modern mouth is pampered with peppermint gel and soft nylon bristles, the medieval mouth endured something far more rugged, a blend of earth, fire, and ancient herbal memory, carried out with quiet determination and a touch of hope. If you stepped into a medieval home just after supper, you might hear the soft clinking of wooden bowls being gathered, or the scrape of bread crusts being swept from a table. But you'd rarely hear the swishing of a mouthwash, or at least, not the kind we know today. Instead, the rinses used in the Middle Ages were far more pungent, unpredictable, and often unpleasant. There was no minty freshness, no foaming bubbles. Instead, people reached for the strong stuff, vinegar, wine, and herbal concoctions that tingled, burned, or numbed the mouth in strange ways. Why vinegar? For one, it was widely available. Most homes, even the humblest ones, had some kind of vinegar, made from spoiled wine or fermented fruits. Vinegar was used in cooking, in preservation, and as a basic cleaning agent. It was believed to purify, to cut through filth, and to ward off infection, so it made sense to use it in the mouth as well. After all, if it could pickle vegetables and disinfect wounds, maybe it could also rid the mouth of whatever invisible forces cause bad breath or aching gums. To create a simple rinse, one might dilute vinegar with water and perhaps mix in a pinch of salt. Some went further, steeping herbs in the solution, mint for freshness, sage for cleansing, or cloves for their warming, numbing properties. These homemade mixtures were stored in ceramic jugs or reused bottles, ready to be poured into a wooden cup for a brisk gargle. And it was brisk because vinegar could sting. It burned the soft tissues of the mouth, especially if there were any open sores or sensitive gums. But that burn was interpreted as power. If it hurt, it must be working. Wine, on the other hand, offered a more luxurious rinse. While vinegar was harsh and biting, wine had a soothing, numbing quality due to its alcohol content. It wasn't used as often by the poor, who could rarely spare wine for anything other than drinking. But in wealthier homes, particularly among the nobility and the clergy, rinsing with wine, especially after a meal, was considered not only hygienic, but refined. Sometimes it was warmed slightly and infused with herbs before being used as a mouth rinse. The warmth relaxed the muscles of the face and neck, and the alcohol helped dull any lingering discomfort. In some cases, this rinse was swirled slowly around the mouth while the person walked or sat by the fire, almost like a ritual of digestion and relaxation. Medieval medical texts occasionally mention these rinses, describing them with phrases like to sweeten the breath, to fortify the gums, or to clear the humours from the mouth. Humours were the dominant medical theory of the time: 4 bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, that had to be kept in balance. A foul-smelling mouth, swollen gums, or persistent toothache might be seen as a sign of excessive phlegm or heat. A herbal rinse in wine or vinegar was thought to rebalance the humours, drawing out what didn't belong. Interestingly, some mouth rinses were not liquid at all, but powders meant to be swished dry. A person might toss a pinch of powdered sage or burnt rosemary into their mouth and swish it around with their own saliva, then spit it out. It was gritty, yes, but also invigorating. The taste was sharp and earthy, and the texture helped scrub the tongue and gums. This dry swish technique was especially useful when clean water was hard to find, or during travel, when carrying liquid rinses was impractical. But not all rinses were intended to clean. Some were meant to heal. When a person had a sore tooth or swollen gum, healers might prescribe a rinse of warm milk infused with garlic and honey, or wine laced with myrrh and cloves. These soothing brews were left in the mouth for minutes at a time, then spit into the fire, as if releasing the sickness back into the world. Certain rituals even called for spitting 3 times, or whispering a prayer while rinsing, merging physical and spiritual care into one quiet act. For children and the very old, stronger rinses were often replaced with gentler ones: rosewater, chamomile tea, or a weak infusion of fennel. These mild liquids didn't sting, but they also didn't offer the same sharp sense of cleansing that stronger mixtures did. They were more about comfort than hygiene, a balm rather than a scrub. And then there were the desperate measures. In cases of persistent halitosis, or what they called foul breath of the belly, people turned to the strangest concoctions. Rinses made from boiled leeks and goat's milk, or fermented barley water with salt and vinegar. Some believed that the breath's foulness came not from the mouth, but from the stomach rising like a vapor, and so the rinse had to be swallowed to work. These methods were not just uncomfortable, They were often repulsive. But for those living with constant oral pain or social embarrassment, they were worth trying. It's worth noting that not everyone used rinses. Many simply wiped their mouths after eating and moved on. But for those who did take the time, who valued a fresh mouth, who believed in the power of herbs and vinegar, mouth rinses were part of a larger philosophy. Life was full of hardship, and the body was fragile. Taking care of the mouth was not just about teeth, but about maintaining strength, dignity, and connection with others. After all, a foul-smelling mouth could cause embarrassment or shame during conversation, prayer, or even confession. And so, with a splash of vinegar, a swish of wine, and a grimace against the burn, they did what they could. Today, we turn a knob and rinse with minty blue liquid that promises whitening, strengthening, and anti-plaque power. But centuries ago, people relied on the sting of the earth, the wisdom of herbs, and the hum of faith to clean what they could not see. The act was simple. The hope behind it was eternal. In the winding alleys of medieval towns and the wide fields of rural villages, the air was thick with the smell of cooking fires, livestock, unwashed clothing, and, often, human breath untouched by modern hygiene. And yet, despite the absence of toothpaste and toothbrushes, people still noticed when someone's breath was unbearable. They may not have known about bacteria or dental decay, but they certainly understood the social and personal discomfort of a foul mouth. Breath was not just physical, it was social currency. And in the Middle Ages, the way your breath smelled could influence everything from your courtship to your confession. It was no secret that medieval diets were pungent. The average person consumed a daily array of sharp, earthy, and spicy foods: raw garlic, onions, leeks, fermented fish, strong cheeses, vinegars, salted meats, ale, and cabbage. Many of these items were staples, cheap, hearty, and available through all seasons. But they also left behind a powerful odor in the mouth, one that lingered far longer than most people would have liked. Garlic and onions were especially notorious. Eaten both raw and cooked, they were praised for their supposed medicinal benefits. Garlic was believed to warm the body and protect against illness, while onions were said to purify the blood and ward off evil spirits. But both were also well known for their after effects: sharp, sour breath that could hang in the air for hours. Still, few shied away from these foods. They were trusted, nourishing, and sometimes even considered sacred. Rather than avoiding smelly foods, people often leaned into them, normalizing the scent of the communal meal and the lingering aftermath. It was understood that breath wasn't always pleasant, and as long as everyone smelled similarly, it wasn't a source of shame. In fact, among the lower classes, a strong mouth odor might even signal a good appetite and a healthy constitution. It was only when someone's breath became particularly foul or unusual, accompanied by pain or swelling, that it drew concern. To counteract bad breath, people turned once again to nature. Chewing aromatic herbs became a common practice, especially after meals or before social encounters. Fennel seeds, anise, cloves, parsley, mint leaves, and even cinnamon bark were chewed to freshen the breath and soothe the stomach. These herbs didn't just smell nice, they were thought to calm digestive gases, which were believed to rise from the belly into the mouth. In a time when most bad breath was blamed on imbalanced humours or fumes of the gut, treating digestion and breath were often seen as the same task. These practices weren't just utilitarian, they could be deeply personal or even intimate. A mother might tuck a sprig of mint into her child's pocket before church. A lover might offer a clove after dinner, both as a gesture of care and a hint of what was to come. In courtly circles, Offering fragrant herbs was considered a subtle form of flirtation or favor, and perfumed breath was, for the elite, something close to sensual refinement. But when herbs failed, people sought more dramatic solutions. Chewing on resin or tree sap was one such method. Certain resins, like mastic gum from the mastic tree, were prized for their strong flavor and antiseptic properties. People chewed them slowly, letting the bitter sap coat the mouth and mask deeper odors. It wasn't always pleasant. It could be sticky, harsh, and linger on the tongue, but it worked, at least for a time. Others swore by stronger, more intense methods, biting into citrus peels if they could afford imported fruits, swishing with wine or ale, or even holding vinegar in the mouth to burn away unpleasant flavors. But these methods were rough and sometimes painful, especially for people already suffering from toothaches or ulcers. In those cases, masking the smell wasn't just cosmetic, it was a desperate attempt to conceal suffering. For those without access to herbs or spices, simple rituals took their place. Rinsing with water, wiping the tongue with a cloth, or simply staying quiet were all ways to deal with a mouth that didn't feel clean. Silence, in fact, became its own kind of oral hygiene. If you didn't speak much, you didn't have to worry about anyone noticing your breath. This might help explain why so many medieval social customs involved lowered voices, bowed heads, and minimal speech during meals or religious services. Still, not everyone accepted bad breath as inevitable. Monastic communities, with their strict rules and spiritual disciplines, often paid special attention to bodily cleanliness, including the mouth. Some records describe monks chewing on dried herbs after meals or even rinsing with diluted vinegar before evening prayers. It was not vanity. It was preparation for communion, for speaking sacred words, for being pure in body as well as soul. But in the end, most people simply accepted that their breath was part of their body's natural function. They ate strong foods, they chewed herbs when they could, and they went about their lives. If someone's breath was truly unbearable, people might quietly step away, cover their nose with a sleeve, or offer them a piece of fennel for their stomach. It was all done gently, without judgment. After all, everyone struggled with the same limitations. So when you imagine a medieval farmer finishing his stew of leeks and garlic, or a baker sipping warm wine after a long day at the oven, remember that their breath, however sharp or smoky, was not just tolerated. It was understood. It was human. And in those quiet moments, when the herbs were chewed and the tongue wiped clean, it was an act of care, however small. In a world full of hardship and survival, even a fragrant breath could be a tiny personal victory. In the medieval world, teeth were not expected to last a lifetime. They were tools, like the hands or the feet, meant to serve a function, not to be cherished for beauty. People accepted that over time, teeth would rot, fall out, or break. Pain was common, solutions were few, and most suffered in silence. There were no dental clinics, no soothing gels, no emergency phone numbers to call in the night. If your tooth ached, you endured it, and if the pain became unbearable, there was one terrifying option: extraction. The tools were simple, brutal, and unforgiving. The most common tooth-pulling instrument was the dental pelican, an early form of forceps that gripped the tooth and wrenched it from the gum with as much force as necessary. Before that, barbers, or barber surgeons as they were known, used pliers, chisels, or even sharpened knives to dig and pry the tooth loose. Anesthesia didn't exist. There was no numbing injection, no gas, not even a guarantee that you wouldn't faint from the pain. Instead, people were often told to grip the arms of a chair, bite down on leather, or drink heavily beforehand. Some were simply held down by family members or assistants while the procedure took place. The barber surgeon played a strange role in medieval society. He cut hair and trimmed beards. Yes, but he also performed minor surgeries, bloodletting, and tooth extractions. His shop was a place of grooming and gore, sometimes decorated with a striped pole, a symbol that would later evolve into the red and white barber's pole, and a reputation built on word of mouth. If he was skilled, his patients healed quickly. If not, they suffered horribly, or worse. Tooth pulling was not guaranteed to go smoothly. Teeth could shatter during extraction, roots could remain embedded, infections could spread. And yet, despite the risks, people came, because the alternative was living with the agony of an abscessed or rotting tooth. When the pain of a toothache began, people tried everything before resorting to extraction. Herbal poultices were common, mashes of garlic, crushed sage, clove oil, or even ground onions, packed around the affected tooth to draw out evil humours. Heated bricks or stones might be wrapped in cloth and pressed to the cheek for warmth and relief. Some people were advised to chew on certain roots or bark to ease inflammation. Others tied charms around their necks, whispered prayers, or visited local wise women who specialized in natural remedies. Tooth pain wasn't just a medical issue, it was a spiritual one. It meant something was wrong inside the body or the soul. But when none of these remedies worked, when the pain throbbed into the jaw or seeped up into the temple, extraction was inevitable, and it was feared. Some people waited days, even weeks, in growing agony before finally visiting the barber. Others went in desperation, unable to eat or sleep. The procedure could be over in seconds, or drag out for excruciating minutes. A good surgeon could pull a tooth quickly, sometimes in a single motion. A less skilled hand might break the tooth, requiring painful digging and twisting to remove the rest. There are records of people passing out from the shock. Others had to be carried home, bleeding and shaking. In some cases, the pain didn't end with the extraction. Infections were common, especially if pieces of the tooth or root remained behind. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, the body had to fight off whatever bacteria entered the open wound. Sometimes it succeeded. Sometimes it didn't. People died from something as simple as an untreated tooth infection that spread into the jaw or bloodstream. It was a quiet kind of death, slow and difficult to diagnose, especially in villages where medical knowledge was scarce. For those who lost many teeth over time, eating became a challenge. Tough breads, nuts, and meats required grinding and tearing. People adapted by soaking their food in broth or tearing it into small pieces. Peasants, whose diets already relied on soft grains and stews, fared better than nobles with sugar-rotted teeth who struggled to chew their fancy fare. Over time, many simply adjusted, chewing slowly, favoring one side of the mouth, or avoiding harder foods altogether. Toothlessness was seen not as a deformity, but as a natural part of aging. Elders with missing teeth were common and accepted. In fact, a gap-toothed smile might have even carried a sense of wisdom or seniority. False teeth existed, but they were rare, expensive, and uncomfortable. In some cases, replacement teeth were made from bone, ivory, or even the teeth of animals, or, disturbingly, from the teeth of other people. These were lashed into place with wire or gold thread, more for appearance than function. Only the wealthy could afford such solutions, and even then, they were difficult to wear and prone to infection. Most people simply lived without teeth once they lost them. It's easy to forget how painful a toothache can be until one strikes. Now imagine facing that pain with no dentist, no numbing, and no idea if relief would ever come. This was the daily reality of medieval life. Tooth care wasn't just about cleaning, it was about survival. Keeping a tooth meant keeping the ability to eat, speak, and live without constant pain. Losing it meant facing trauma and possibly death. And yet, People endured. They found strength in ritual, in plants, in the community that surrounded them. A tooth might be pulled in the center of a village, with neighbors watching, or it might happen by firelight in a quiet cottage, with a father pulling the tooth of his own son using a homemade tool. There were screams, there were tears, but life went on. In the end, teeth were not forever, but people were resilient. They knew the risks and they took them anyway. They chewed, they rinsed, they hoped. And when that hope failed, they clenched their fists, whispered prayers, and let the pain be taken from them, one tooth at a time. In the grand halls of castles and behind the silk curtains of royal chambers, it might be tempting to imagine that kings and queens, nobles and aristocrats enjoyed sparkling white smiles and the finest hygiene their era could offer. After all, they had wealth, power, and access to rare goods. But the truth is far more humbling. When it came to dental care, even the most powerful figures in medieval society were at the mercy of the same limitations as everyone else. In some cases, their high status even made things worse. Wealth in the Middle Ages brought many privileges: silk clothing, elaborate meals, and refined comforts. But it also brought an early and dangerous relationship with one particular luxury: sugar. While the average peasant rarely, if ever, tasted sugar, nobles and royals imported it at great cost from distant lands. At first, it was used sparingly as a spice or a medicine, mixed with bitter herbs, or used to sweeten wine. Over time, however, sugar became a symbol of status. The more you had, the more important you were. And so it appeared in confections, pastries, candied fruits, and elaborate desserts served at royal feasts. This indulgence had a hidden cost. Sugar is one of the most destructive substances for teeth, especially in an age with no concept of dental plaque, cavities, or oral bacteria. The more the elite consumed it, the more their teeth began to decay. Blackened molars, broken incisors, and chronic dental infections were not uncommon among the upper classes. It was not unusual for royalty to suffer in silence, or to disguise the damage as best they could. Queen Elizabeth I of England, for example, was known to have a great fondness for sugar. As a result, many of her teeth turned black during her lifetime, and her breath was rumoured to be unpleasant in her later years. There are accounts of her using cloth soaked in wine to dab her gums and even having false teeth fashioned to hide the gaps in her smile. And she was not alone. Aristocrats across Europe, from France to the Holy Roman Empire, shared similar fates. Their wealth allowed them to afford luxury, but it did not protect them from its consequences. Despite their status, the nobility's options for dental care were still rudimentary. They might have access to private physicians or apothecaries, but those professionals focused more on overall health than on dental precision. Remedies often included herbal mouth rinses, tooth powders made from powdered coral or crushed pearls, and elaborate tinctures with myrrh, vinegar, and cloves. These were elegant, aromatic, and costly, but not necessarily effective. Many of these mixtures did little to stop the decay eating away beneath the surface. In fact, some treatments may have caused more harm than good. For instance, the use of strong acids, such as vinegar or citrus, was believed to clean and brighten the teeth. In truth, it eroded enamel over time. Powdered pumice, used to scrub the teeth clean, could wear them down to their roots. The intention was noble, to maintain a beautiful appearance and a dignified presence. But the tools at their disposal were primitive, and the results were often tragic. To hide their dental problems, royals sometimes covered their mouths when they spoke or smiled. Fans, gloves, and elaborate collars served not just as fashion statements, but as subtle shields for decayed teeth or swollen jaws. In portraits, monarchs were often painted with closed lips or from angles that disguised dental imperfections. Appearance was everything, and admitting to pain, especially tooth pain, was considered weak or undignified. When dental problems became unbearable, even royalty had to face the dreaded extraction. While they may have had more skilled surgeons or better instruments, the experience was still agonizing. Accounts from royal courts describe teeth being pulled with gold-handled tools. But the pain was the same. Sudden, searing, unforgettable. There are even records of kings being treated for tooth infections by lancing the gums with hot needles or draining abscesses with sharpened knives. To cope, the upper classes often turned to opiates or wine-soaked cloths to dull the pain. In some regions, clove oil, one of the few truly effective natural numbing agents, was applied to infected teeth. These treatments brought short-lived relief, but the underlying problem usually persisted. Interestingly, the nobility's visible struggles with dental health sometimes inspired fear or fascination among the lower classes. A black-toothed queen or a king with sunken cheeks from lost molars could become the subject of rumor or superstition. Some believed that tooth rot in the powerful was a sign of divine punishment or internal corruption. Others saw it as proof that wealth couldn't buy health, that even those dressed in jewels and gold were still vulnerable, still human. And yet, for all their struggles, the elite never stopped trying. They commissioned elaborate ivory toothpicks and gold-plated tongue scrapers. They imported the finest herbs and rarest oils. They employed personal attendants to help with hygiene rituals each morning. They even wrote letters to apothecaries, requesting new blends of powders and rinses, in hopes of finding some cure for the pain that crept through their jaws each winter. In time, this obsession with appearance and oral hygiene among the upper classes would pave the way for early dentistry. Some of the first formal writings on dental care came from royal physicians seeking to ease the discomfort of their noble patients. Slowly, a new understanding began to form, still crude, but inching toward the modern field of dental science. So while we might laugh today at the idea of a queen brushing with crushed pearls, or a prince rinsing with wine and salt, it's worth remembering that behind the glittering crowns were aching mouths and desperate efforts. The royal smile, for all its grandeur, often hid a world of discomfort and decay. And in that hidden world, we see a truth that crosses time and status. Teeth, no matter how white or gold-covered, are vulnerable. And even kings and queens, wrapped in velvet and guarded by knights, could not escape the quiet, creeping pain of a tooth gone bad. Hidden in the pages of dusty manuscripts and tucked away in the fading ink of monastic herbals lie the whispers of medieval dental recipes, curious, creative, and sometimes downright bizarre. Before toothpaste came in tubes, and before dental care became a science, people turned to the apothecaries and herbalists of their time to craft remedies from the natural world. These recipes weren't just attempts at hygiene. They were deeply rooted in a blend of tradition, observation, and trial and error. Each mixture told a story, not just of medicine, but of belief, ritual, and the endless human effort to overcome pain and decay. The typical medieval dental remedy began with a base of something gritty, an abrasive to scrub the surface of the teeth. Ground eggshells were common, as were powdered oyster shells, crushed bones, or even brick dust. The goal was to physically scrape away build-up and food residue. Of course, there was no awareness of enamel or sensitivity. If it felt rough and cleaned something off, it was considered effective, even if it was slowly grinding away the very teeth it was meant to preserve. These gritty substances were often mixed with salts, ashes, or dried herbs. Sage was a favorite, not only for its medicinal properties, but for its symbolic value. It was believed to bring wisdom and protection, and chewing its leaves or applying it to the teeth was thought to keep both the body and spirit pure. Mint and parsley were also frequent additions, valued for their ability to freshen the breath and cool the mouth. Dried rosemary, ground into a fine powder, was used for its astringent and antibacterial qualities, though again, no one understood bacteria by name. They recognized its ability to help with swelling of the gums or bad humors of the mouth. One recipe, found in a 13th century English herbal, called for fennel seeds, burnt alum, and vinegar. The fennel was to be roasted and crushed, the alum ground to a fine powder, and the entire mixture soaked in strong vinegar overnight. In the morning, the user would dip a cloth into the solution and scrub their teeth and gums. The alum gave the rinse a sharp, puckering quality, something between metallic and bitter, which was believed to draw out infection and cool the blood. Another popular mixture, especially in France and Italy, involved mixing honey with powdered cinnamon and clove. Honey acted as a binding agent and was thought to nourish the gums, while cinnamon and clove provided a warm, numbing sensation. Clove, in particular, had mild analgesic properties due to its eugenol content. Medieval people couldn't explain this chemically, but they knew it worked. Chewing on whole cloves or rubbing clove oil on sore teeth became one of the more effective and pleasant dental remedies available. Yet not all recipes were so gentle. Some called for ingredients we might find shocking today. Burnt mouse bones, snake fat, or even dried human urine were sometimes used in obscure folk remedies. These were usually passed down orally in rural communities, part of a body of peasant magic and superstition. The idea was not only to treat the physical symptoms, but to counteract spiritual causes, curses, evil eyes, or demonic possession that might be causing pain. Toothaches were often seen as punishments, not just illnesses, and so the remedies had to be strange enough to scare off whatever evil had taken hold. Others focused on soothing rather than scrubbing. Herbal infusions were brewed like tea and used as mouth rinses or gargles. Chamomile, marjoram, and lavender were often included, especially when pain or swelling was present. Some recipes instructed the user to swish the warm infusion for the length of a prayer, or until the tongue no longer feels the sting. These remedies, though less abrasive, provided comfort and a sense of ritual, reinforcing the idea that care and patience could slowly restore health. Recipes were often personalized. An apothecary might tailor a mixture depending on a person's age, health, or social class. For a nobleman, expensive spices like saffron, myrrh, or frankincense might be added, less for function than for fragrance and prestige. These luxury ingredients, imported at great cost, were believed to offer divine protection or purification. Their inclusion turned a dental remedy into something closer to a spiritual tonic. In monastic settings, where knowledge was preserved and copied, dental recipes were recorded with surprising detail. Monks tended medicinal gardens, drying and cataloguing herbs according to ancient texts by Galen or Dioscorides. Some monasteries kept dedicated volumes for bodily care, including specific sections for the mouth. Here, one might find a remedy such as: take dried mint and sage, equal parts, and grind with sea salt. Mix with honey and rub upon the teeth each morning with a cloth of linen. Another might read: to drive out foul breath, steep thyme and wormwood in vinegar for 3 days, then gargle after meals while reciting the Psalms. The role of faith was never far from medicine in these times. Prayers were often included alongside recipes, invoking saints believed to protect against pain or disease. Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry, was frequently called upon. According to legend, she had all her teeth broken out during martyrdom, and so medieval Christians believed she would show mercy to those suffering from dental pain. Her name was sometimes written on slips of parchment and placed under pillows, or whispered during the application of tooth powders, as if her presence might calm the inflammation. Despite the limitations of the time, these recipes were more than crude attempts. They were acts of care. They showed a deep, intuitive connection between the natural world and the human body. Medieval people might not have had floss or fluoride, but they had rosemary growing outside the door and sage drying above the hearth. They knew which plants soothed, which burned, and which made the mouth feel cool and clean. Their recipes weren't always effective by modern standards, but they carried with them centuries of experience, belief, and hope. And in those quiet moments, early in the morning before prayer, or late at night after supper, a person might take their linen cloth, dip it into a jar of herbal paste, and gently rub away the wear of the day. In that moment, surrounded by candlelight and silence, they were participating in something ancient and deeply human. The need to care for the self, to ease discomfort, and to believe that healing might come, one leaf, one drop, one careful mixture at a time. The gulf between peasant and noble in medieval society was vast and visible, reflected in clothing, speech, manners, and, less obviously, in their teeth. Though we tend to imagine that the wealthy lived cleaner, more comfortable lives, the reality of oral health in the Middle Ages tells a different story. In an unexpected twist of history, the peasant, poor, often barefoot, and clothed in rough-spun wool, was more likely to have a healthy mouth than the silk-draped noble who dined on delicate pastries and spiced meats. The reason? Simplicity. The daily diet of the average peasant was grounded in what the land could provide. Coarse brown bread, pottage made from grains and legumes, root vegetables like onions and turnips, wild greens, a bit of cheese, and occasionally a small piece of preserved meat or fish. It was humble fare, often monotonous and bland, but it was surprisingly kind to the teeth. The absence of sugar, the low levels of refined carbohydrates, and the fibrous nature of the food meant that plaque had fewer places to take hold. Additionally, the rough textures of stone-ground bread and gritty gruel provided a natural abrasive that scrubbed the surface of the teeth, helping to reduce build-up without the need for brushing. These natural abrasions came with a cost. Over time, the constant chewing of rough bread, often flecked with bits of stone from the mill, wore down the enamel, flattening the teeth and exposing the dentin. But this was a slow process, and it didn't necessarily cause decay. In fact, archaeological studies of medieval skeletons often reveal peasant skulls with teeth that, while worn, show relatively few cavities or signs of infection. The wear was mechanical, not microbial. Their mouths were not pristine, but they were stable. Contrast this with the diet of the nobility. Lords and ladies feasted on refined white bread, made with finely sifted flour and very little bran. They indulged in preserved fruits, candied nuts, and confections soaked in honey, or, for those truly wealthy, imported cane sugar. These foods clung to the teeth and fostered the kind of bacterial growth that leads to decay. Because they lacked a modern understanding of bacteria or acid erosion, they continued to enjoy these luxuries without realizing they were undermining their own dental health. While a peasant might chew on tough crusts and drink water, a noble would sip sweetened wine and nibble soft cakes, fuel for the slow destruction of the mouth. Another key difference was routine. Peasants, despite their lack of formal knowledge, often lived in closer connection with nature and its rhythms. Herbs grew at their doorsteps. They might chew mint leaves for a sour stomach or sage for a sore throat, not realizing they were also helping their breath. Many traditions passed down through generations included basic oral care. rinsing the mouth after meals with water from a well, or using a frayed stick to dislodge food. These habits were born from necessity and instinct rather than education, but they served their purpose well. Nobles, on the other hand, relied on apothecaries and attendants to manage their health. They might possess golden toothpicks and jars of perfumed powder, but the actual effectiveness of their care was hit or miss. It was often more about appearances than practicality. Rinsing with rosewater or dabbing the gums with myrrh felt refined, but did little to stop the progression of rot. Even when dental problems became severe, the rich hesitated to submit to the crude treatments of barber surgeons. They could afford to wait, even as the infection spread. In some cases, the preference for elegance over action led to slow, painful suffering. Social behavior also played a role. Among peasants, communal living and open conversation meant that toothaches and remedies were often shared topics. If someone had a poultice that worked, it would be passed along. But in noble circles, dental problems were hidden, shrouded in shame. A noblewoman would never admit to a rotting tooth at court, nor would a prince openly seek treatment for foul breath. The culture of secrecy around bodily discomfort allowed problems to fester. Additionally, the working life of a peasant, though brutal in many ways, provided certain dental benefits. The physical labor kept circulation high and the immune system active. Constant movement, exposure to fresh air, and a relatively plant-based diet supported general health, including the mouth. Conversely, the sedentary lifestyle of many aristocrats, combined with rich foods, indoor confinement, and stress, made them more susceptible to illness, including oral infections. The contrast was so striking that, in some regions, physicians began to notice the pattern. Writings from late medieval and early Renaissance periods note that the lower sorts do suffer less with the rot of the teeth, though they didn't know why. The pattern persisted quietly, a curious footnote in the complex story of health and hierarchy. Of course, it would be misleading to romanticize peasant life. Tooth loss did happen. Painful abscesses occurred. Without access to skilled treatment, many endured suffering in silence or turned to desperate folk remedies, rubbing garlic into the gums, biting down on hot stones, or praying to St. Apollonia. But statistically, their diet and lifestyle shielded them from some of the more devastating effects of dental decay. So when we picture the medieval world, it's worth flipping our expectations. The nobleman in his fur-lined robe, dining beneath a golden chandelier, may well have had fewer teeth than the ploughman in the field. The lady with the silver mirror and scented linen might have suffered from constant toothache, while the farmer's wife, scrubbing her pot with herbs from the yard, retained her molars well into old age. Dental health in the Middle Ages wasn't a matter of wealth. It was a matter of wisdom, diet, and luck. And sometimes, the simplest life turned out to be the healthiest. Among the chickens and the turnips, the peasants chewed, rinsed, spat, and smiled, gap-toothed perhaps, but often with less pain than the lords above them. In the quiet hours of the medieval evening, as candles flickered low and the world softened into shadow, people put aside their tools, hung up their cloaks, and sat close to the hearth. There were no electric lights, no buzzing televisions, no glowing screens, only firelight and silence, and perhaps the low murmur of prayer or a song drifting from a neighbor's home. It was in these moments of stillness that the human experience became most visible, stripped of all pretense. And among the many things that bound these people together, kings, peasants, monks, and merchants, was something so small, so simple, and yet so deeply human: the act of smiling. Smiling in the medieval world was not about white teeth or cosmetic perfection. It wasn't rehearsed or filtered or frozen for a photograph. It was genuine, instinctive, and reflective of a person's inner state. People smiled in joy, in grief, in resignation, and in reverence. And whether they had all their teeth or only a few, whether their breath smelled of mint or of garlic, that smile was as real and meaningful as any expression known to us today. The state of one's teeth, while certainly noticed, did not define one's worth or social acceptance. Children laughed freely with crooked teeth. Elders told stories around the fire, lips pulled back over worn and weathered gums. Young lovers exchanged glances that needed no polish or perfect alignment, just sincerity. The medieval smile was not about appearance but about connection. A person's face told a story that no mirror ever needed to validate. In this world of rudimentary dental care and limited remedies, people developed an acceptance of imperfection. A chipped tooth from a fall, a darkened molar from years of tough bread, a gap where a tooth had long since vanished. These were not shameful flaws, but marks of life lived. Teeth were seen as functional, not ornamental. As long as one could eat, speak, and breathe without agony, the state of the mouth was rarely cause for distress. This acceptance brought with it a kind of peace. While today we are inundated with messages of whitening strips, cosmetic veneers, and digital filters, medieval people lived more fully in the natural state of things. They understood the inevitability of wear and decay, of the body aging and changing. They did what they could to care for themselves with the tools they had: herbs for breath, twigs for cleaning, cloths for wiping, and when all else failed, prayer for courage. And then they let the rest go. There's something quietly beautiful in that surrender. A blackened tooth wasn't a failure, it was a sign of age, of survival. A missing molar was not a defect, but evidence of meals enjoyed and days endured. A crooked row of incisors didn't signal neglect, but rather the hand of nature, untouched by intervention. And so, people smiled anyway. They smiled as they danced at harvest festivals, stomping their feet on dirt floors. They smiled at the births of children, at the telling of a well-loved tale, at the turning of seasons. Monks smiled over shared bread in candlelit cloisters. Soldiers smiled with relief after a long battle. Mothers smiled through tears as they rocked their infants to sleep. The smile, imperfect, toothy or toothless, was a gesture of resilience, of grace in the face of a hard life. Even in art, where idealization was common, smiles were subtle but significant. In medieval paintings and illuminated manuscripts, faces often bear the faintest hint of a smile, enigmatic, peaceful, serene. These were not grins of pride or display, but quiet acknowledgments of joy or sacredness. The smile was an inner light, not an outer performance. In death, as in life, the smile held its place. When bodies were buried, teeth were often among the few parts that remained intact centuries later, silent witnesses to lives lived long ago. Archaeologists, brushing dirt from the jawbones of villagers and nobles alike, sometimes find teeth worn smooth by decades of chewing or decayed by sugar's bite. But in both cases, they are markers of humanity, of meals eaten, songs sung, and laughter shared under the same stars that shine today. Today, in a world where we strive so hard to perfect our smiles, to straighten, whiten, and edit them into glossy ideals, there is something soothing in remembering that for most of human history, smiles were raw, unfiltered, and beloved all the same. The medieval smile, whether bright or broken, was real. It came from a place of endurance, simplicity, and presence. So as we reflect on the medieval mouth, not polished, but purposeful, not straight, but strong, we can perhaps learn something. That our smiles do not need to be flawless to be beautiful. That there is dignity in age, in imperfection, in naturalness. and that the most important thing about a smile is not how it looks, but where it comes from. Even now, hundreds of years later, if you were to close your eyes and imagine a peasant by the fire or a queen in her garden, and they looked at you and smiled, you might not see perfect teeth, but you would see warmth, recognition, and shared humanity. And in that moment, you would understand. A quiet smile from the past can still reach across time and speak directly to the heart.